Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about integers, additive inverses, as well as absolute value. Our content objective is students will be able to graph and order integers, find the absolute value and additive inverses of integers. Our language objective is students will be able to state examples of numbers that are integers, as well as write numerical expressions from word phrases. Well, why am I learning this? Well, it's important for many real-world problems like representing the scores in golf. So the essential question is, how can the properties of operation be applied to adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing? So first of all, we're going to go over some background knowledge. An integer is basically the set of positive whole numbers, negative whole numbers, and zero. So here are some examples. You can see them as a number line. Again, they're all whole numbers, including negatives, positives, as well as zero. Any number to the right of zero is considered a positive number. Anything to the left of zero is considered negative. And zero is neither. We call it the origin. It's not positive or negative. Here, it says write an integer from the following word phrases. If it's a gain of 5 yards, I would say that's a positive 5. If it's a loss of 20 gallons, that would be negative 20. A deposit of 343, well, you're adding money, so we're going to say positive 343. A penalty of 20 means you lose 20 points, so I'm going to say minus 20. A profit, again, that's a gain of $38, so I'm just going to say plus 38. A withdrawal of $12, well, that you're taking away money, 12, so here you're going to say negative 12. 2 hours before lunch, that's before, so I'm going to say negative 2. And then 30 degrees above zero is going to be a positive 30. So here, now we're going to ask you to write an integer that represents the net result. So here, if it's a gain of 5 yards, that would be positive 5, followed by a loss of 5 yards. That would be negative 5. Here, a deposit of $343, that's going to be a positive 343, followed by a withdrawal of 343. Well, that's taking money away, so that's negative 343. 30 degrees below zero. Well, that's below, so that's negative 30, compared to 30 degrees above zero, so that's positive, so we're going to say positive 30. 2 hours before lunch. Okay, so it's before, so we're going to call that negative 2, compared to 2 hours after lunch. That's going to be after, so I'm going to say positive 2. Okay, so more background knowledge of vocabulary. Opposites are numbers on opposite sides of zero. So for example, 2 and negative 2 are examples. Here, I can give you a visual. 2 is here, and negative 2 would be in the opposite direction. So instead of 2 to the right, I would go 2 to the left. That would make it a negative 2. So they are on opposite sides of 0. Negative 9 and 9 are opposites. Okay, so additive inverses, what are they? Well, they're two numbers with the sum of 0. Okay, opposite numbers are additive inverses. So here, negative 3 and 3 are additive inverses. 17 and negative 17 are additive inverses. And further proof, if you say negative 3 plus 3, it would give you 0. 17 plus negative 17 would be 0. Negative 324 and 324 additive inverses. Again, why? Because if you add these two numbers, it would give you 0. Now, could you think of an example that is an additive inverse in two numbers? Okay, so let's just go ahead and move on. So absolute value is the distance a number from 0 on a number line. So here, let's see. If we take the absolute value of 3, how far is 3 from 0? Well, it's 1, 2, 3 away. So I would say the answer is 3. Okay, number 10, what's the absolute value of negative 4? Well, negative 4 is here. How far is it from 0? 1, 2, 3, 4. So that would be 4. So here, we don't see 11 in our number line, but we know how far is 11 from 0. It's going to be 11. What about negative 8? Again, we don't see it on our number line, but if you consider how far is negative 8 to 0, I would say it's 8. Okay, so number 13, how far is negative 19 from 0? I would say 19. And how far is 0 from 0? Well, Nothing, so I would say 0. So notice the absolute value, we're not taking the opposite of anything. We are simply trying to figure out the distance that number is from 0. And hopefully you understand distance can't be negative. Even if I, for example, if I walk backwards 3 steps, I technically took 3 steps. I didn't take negative 3 steps. So it's important to understand when we're looking at the absolute value, we're thinking of the distance from 0. So once again, the absolute value will always be positive, with the exception with a negative before the absolute value. So something that looks like this. Okay, you would actually read this as the opposite of the absolute value of 102. So think about it. When you have to take the opposite of something, you have to first figure out what that something is. So here, what is the absolute value of 102? 102. Well, what's the opposite of it? It would be negative 102. So here is an example where the result of the absolute value along with the negative sign up front would be negative, and that's your only case. Here, okay, let's think. What's the absolute value of negative 75? I would say 75. But then what do you have to do? You have to take the opposite of that, and so now you would say the opposite of 75 is negative 75. So once again, that is the only case where your answer will end up being negative. So let's take a look at some examples. What's the absolute value of negative 12? Well, how far is negative 12 from 0? I would say 12. Number 16, what's the absolute value of 27? Well, how far is 27 from 0? I would say 27. Okay, so here, be careful. You would read this as the opposite of the absolute value of 6. Well, what's the absolute value? Sorry, the absolute value of negative 6. Well, the absolute value of negative 6 is 6, but then what's the opposite of that? It would be a negative 6. Okay, here, what is the opposite of the absolute value of 53? Well, the absolute value of 53 is just 53, and the opposite of that would make it a negative 53. Okay, so the last one. What is the absolute value of negative 72? Well, let's write out the absolute value of a negative 72. Well, how far is negative 72 from 0? It's just 72. And notice we're not taking the opposite of it, so we're just going to stay as 72. So the tricky part is just remembering that you first need to take care of what's inside the absolute value symbol, because it's basically considered as a grouping, like parentheses and whatnot. So you want to take care of that first, and then if need be, if you have to take the opposite of it, then you should. Okay, so now let's take some more practice. We're going to compare an additive inverses as well as absolute value. Let's see if they're always going to be the same, if they're going to be different, what's going to happen. So the additive inverse of 7 would be negative 7. I know this because 7 plus a negative 7 gives you 0. Well, the absolute value of 7, well, how far is 7 from 0? 7, so I would say 7. Additive inverse of negative 16 is a positive 16. The absolute value of a negative 16, well, how far is negative 16 from 0? I would say just 16. The additive inverse of negative 8 would be 8. And once again, I know these are additive inverses because if I take negative 8 plus 8, it would be 0. Negative 16 plus 16 would be 0, etc. Here, the absolute value of a negative 8, well, how far is negative 8 from 0? I would say 8. Here, what's the additive inverse of a positive 33? Will be a negative 33 because positive 33 plus negative 33 is 0. The absolute value of a positive 33 would just still be 33 because that's how far it is from 0. Additive inverse of 0, well, it's just 0 because 0 is like neutral. It's the origin. It's neither positive or negative. So the absolute value would again just still be 0. So moving on. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to be asked to compare the numbers. We can say less than, greater than, or equal to. So just a quick reminder if you're trying to figure out what these mean. This means less than, and this means greater than. Okay. So how do we compare 3 to negative 3? I would say 3 is definitely greater than, so I would draw this symbol here. And you're going to notice every single time the symbol is going to point to the smaller number. So here, number 21, what's the absolute value of negative 9? Well, it's 9. So how does 9 compare to 9? Well, they're equal. Negative 6 and the absolute value of 6. Well, the absolute value of 6 is still just 6. I would say negative 6 is less than 6, so I'm going to go ahead and write this symbol here, which is the less than symbol. And again, you'll notice that it's always pointing to the smaller number. Negative 5 and negative 2. Do not be fooled. Be very careful. The bigger the negative, the smaller it is. So I'm going to go ahead and say that this is less than. Number 24, what's the absolute value of 7? I would say 7. The absolute value of 7 is 7, so here I would say they are equal. Number 25, the absolute value of negative 4 is 4. Here, the opposite of the absolute value of 2. Well, the absolute value of 2 is 2. We have to take the opposite of it, so we're going to make it that a negative 2. Definitely say 4 is greater than negative 2. Positives will always be greater than negatives, so I'm going to go ahead and put the greater than symbol. Here, what's the absolute value of 6? It's just 6. The absolute value of negative 8 is 8. So I'm going to go ahead and say 6 is less than 8. Again, always point to the smaller number. Number 27, the absolute value of negative 3 is 3. But wait, we have to take the opposite of that. So that's going to be negative 3 compared to a negative 2. Again, please do not be fooled. The larger the digit for the negative, the smaller it actually is. So I would say negative 3 is less than negative 2. Number 28, negative 8 compared to the opposite of the absolute value of negative 8. Well, the absolute value of negative 8 is just 8. Taking the opposite of that would be negative 8. I would call this equal. Here, the absolute value of 5 is 5. Compare that to a negative 5. I would say 5 is greater than a negative 5. So that's all there is to it. We just need to make sure we're using the correct symbol. We need to know which each means and make sure we understand when we're taking the absolute value of a number. Once again, we just need to figure out how far that number is from 0. If we do see a negative sign out front of the absolute value, we need to understand that means the opposite of that. So you do that accordingly. Okay, so now what if they give you an expression that you need to simplify? Well, let's see. According to order of operations, I typically do parentheses first. I don't see any parentheses here, but guess what? The absolute value is a grouping. It's in the parentheses category, so I am actually going to do what's inside the absolute value first. So here, what is 11 minus 7? Well, it's 4. So we're still going to take the absolute value of 4, and then we're going to do 9 minus that. So now that we've done that, we're going to finish this and say, okay, what's the absolute value of 4? It's just 4. So we're technically doing 9 minus 4, which gives us 5. So important thing to understand is the absolute value is treated as if it's a parenthesis because it's technically a grouping, and we would take care of that before we move on to any multiplication, division, addition, or subtraction. So it's important to remember to follow order of operations. Okay, so now at this point, I want you to challenge yourself. Go ahead and pause the video and try this one by yourself. So here we want to make sure we simplify what's inside the absolute value first. So here I'm going to simplify 23 minus 9 is going to be, let's see, 14. So we're still going to take the absolute value of that. We're going to minus this right here, 27 minus 14. That's going to be a 13, but let's not forget to take the absolute value of that. So here, what's the absolute value of 14? Well, it's 14 because that's how far it is from 0. Minus the absolute value of 13. Again, that's going to be 13 because that's how far it is from 0. So 14 minus 13 is just 1. So that is our answer. Well, guess what? That actually concludes the lesson for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. And as always, until next time, bye.